Hi, everybody. All right. Can you hear me okay if I talk from this distance? Okay. My name's Amory Abbott. And over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be proposing my thesis topic, outlining the context, influences, materials, and research that will culminate into a final body of work. The concept of my thesis, titled Supernatural, is to create a series of charcoal drawings that feature the landscape of the Pacific Northwest, specifically old-growth forests, to imagine ways one might experience and reflect upon the grandeur and epic quality of the natural world and its allegorical connections to fine art. This project will address two primary concerns in my art practice. First, how to communicate the sense of magic and wonder I feel when in a forest, and second, how to engage deeper conceptual strategies to offer ethical paths forward with environmental landscape art. In order to address these concerns, I've focused my scope of research on three main areas. First is to educate myself on processes of forest ecology to form a greater knowledge of the local natural environment and the consequences of industry within it. Second is to engage the aesthetic influences of classical, romantic, and luminist painting tactics of the Hudson River School to expand on the history of landscape art. And third, to explore embellishments of mythology and the supernatural and fantasy-themed writing and music to inspire visual language strategies in my work. So let's contextualize the work. Starting with the first area of research, educating myself on processes of forest ecology, my area investigation over the last semester has been ecological succession, that being how forests regenerate after a cataclysmic event. So focusing on fire ecology and the faulty history of fire suppression in the United States, where fires in the US have been suppressed for so long that when they occur now, they're massive and completely unmanageable. The work for this past series I've been creating features burnt and broken tree snags lit by a supernatural residual glow of the tree in its living form. As I've been exploring the process of regeneration in the landscape, I've been influenced by the work of Michael Brophy. He's a contemporary painter and a PNCA alumnus who addresses similar concerns in his work. Like mine, Brophy's landscape paintings are biographies of nature. Unlike my work so far, his paintings oftentimes show evidence of human intervention: roads carved into hillsides, logged forest areas, and burns, and reveal landscapes intrinsically tied to human presence. His paintings are observations of environmental changes and events that span time, recalling history and nostalgia in abandoned lands. What is especially engaging about his work is that it depicts nature in a more honest and non-idealized state. No romance, no majesty, just the world as it is, or rather, as it has been shaped today. Another artist dealing with concerns of the natural environment is Zaria Foreman. Her soft pastel drawings feature remote locations, documenting rapidly changing landscapes, and addressing climate concerns. A review on the Creative States blog describes her process. Foreman translates the purity and simplicity of the Arctic water into each pastel stroke, creating a mesmerizing composition that appeals to emotion rather than didacticism. Using aesthetically appealing imagery to drive emotional response, but also engaging in the conceptual goals of the work, is something I try to do with my work as well. Further in line with charcoal medium, I've been influenced by the drawings of Robert Longo, specifically his series, The Mysteries. He uses images of forests, cathedrals, and synagogues silhouetted in bright light. The use of high contrast in the drawings enhances their visual impact and helps convey notions of spectacle and awe that relate to places of worship. What drives his work for me is the rigor involved in the rendering process. There's a grandeur to the size of the work, how it envelops the viewer, transporting them to sacred places, innocent yet inseparable from their cultural implications. So in the style of romantic landscape painting, works from the Hudson River School movement, depict similar themes of the sublime and wild places. Among the second generation of painters to emerge in the mid-1800s after the death of Thomas Cole were Frederick Edwin Church and John Frederick Kensett. Their works over time evolved toward the more fantastical and supernatural. This style shift would later be referred to as luminism or luminist landscape. I'm greatly interested in the introduction of supernatural phenomenon in their later works. It taps a deeper well of inspiration than sublime atmospheric nuance, reviving mythology and discovering magic. The third area of research, I'll be exploring embellishments of mythology and the supernatural. So my first introduction to magic and fantasy was from a vinyl audiobook of The Hobbit I had as a child. Some of my first memories of visual art were from the Lester Abrams paintings in the corresponding picture book on the left side. My fandom for The Hobbit led me to the Tolkien World illustrations of the brothers Hildebrandt and ultimately to Golden Age illustration. Now, fantasy illustration is often too genre-specific and explicative, depicting very clearly mythological and supernatural iconography and characters, and not leaving much to curiosity or the imagination. A contemporary artist that navigates the world of fantasy illustration without confining the narrative context is João Ruas. Like the brothers Hildebrandt, Ruas's drawings are dark, mysterious, and allude to a mythical world full of ancient and timeless characters, but without such straightforward imagery that results in a flat read. Art critic Amanda Erlandson sums up Ruas's work beautifully. Quote, his explorations of the darker realms of the spirit evoke states of emotional turmoil, spiritual hunger, and troubled passion. He describes an ethereal mythos that is somehow deeply personal and disquietingly universal at the same time, end quote. And contextualizing my ideas, the first area is ecological succession. So over the years, backpacking through different forests, hiking, I've been inspired by the lifespan of natural environments, the way they're affected by climate, geographic location, age, and human impact. The need for further understanding of ecological succession was sparked by my recent artist residency at Caldera, an artist retreat inside the Deschutes National Forest just west of Sisters, Oregon. The Caldera property is recovering from the B&B complex fires that killed off most of the forest in the region in August of 2003. While there, I began asking myself questions about the landscape and the trees. How did the fire start? What will grow back? What will change? And how long will it take? These thought experiments began to work their way conceptually into the naturalistic imagery in my work, expanding my methods for ideation. The corresponding research I've chosen for my thesis includes the unique field guide, Cascade Olympic Natural History by Daniel Matthews, that covers more than just plants and animals. The book Forest Primeval by Chris Mazer, which reads like a biography of an ancient forest over a span of 1,000 years in the Cascade Range. Among others, I've also included the book The World Without Us by Alan Wiseman, which engages hypotheses of what a post-human Earth might look like and how nature might reclaim a damaged world. On to mythology and fantasy. So I'm curious about the ways that we explain nature to each other and how it's been regarded across cultures and time with spiritual reverence. The supernatural and spiritual forces in folklore offer fascinating stories that explain the vitality of nature and often emphasize nature-based magic as a healing power, a spiritual entity, and a metaphorical moral compass. I'm interested in creation myths and native legends of mountains and forests and how they can be a generative strategy for imagery in my work. And my research will include indigenous lore of pre-Columbian America, specifically in the regions of the Pacific Northwest, and Ella Clark's Indian Legends of the Pacific Northwest. Broadening my scope of folklore research, I'll also be reading books on other cultural myths and legends, hopefully to find common allegorical threads regarding natural phenomena. This will include the classical Greek mythology of Homer and Ovid, Norse mythology, and East Asian lore. I'll also be looking back into the tales of J.R.R. Tolkien, whose fictional creation myths and stories in the Silmarillion are also inspired by ancient tales from Western and Eastern culture. American Romanticism and metal music. Majority of my past and current work explores imagery with darker supernatural themes. In order to drive the viewer's curiosity in my thesis, I'd like to revive some fantasy tropes to guide the mood of the work, and for that I've chosen two sources, American Romanticism and metal music. American Romanticism, also known as Dark Romanticism, foremost deals with questions of death, mystery, the supernatural, and the limits of understanding. Since the naturalist John Muir walked into the forests of Yosemite in 1868 and proclaimed the wild to Ralph Waldo Emerson as God's big show, the idea of wilderness has been tied to Western ideals of optimism, freedom, divinity, destiny, and the American dream. Dark Romanticism, however, aims to expose the shadows of the past and how they inform the present. With America's history of dissolving native ancestral homelands into federally protected wilderness, fire suppression, and parks conservation, there simultaneously exists a reverence for the sublimity of nature and institutionalized consent to desecrate it for profit and power. Writings by Herman Melville and Edgar Allan Poe seem to grasp at this perplexity of truth and illusion. Their stories refrain from holding humans in the highest regard, admitting their capacity for both good and evil. I see this as an admission of humanity and a willingness to acknowledge mistakes in order to better oneself. It's important for my work to draw from the perspectives of dark romanticism in order to question the ethical basis of human environmental history and what ghosts might still haunt our forests. Relating to the darker side of human existence and its connection to fantasy, I'm also influenced by metal music. Metal music helps me approach my drawings with a youthfully energetic and adventurous mindset, specifically the subgenres of epic power metal and symphonic black metal. Epic power metal typically uses medieval quest adventure themes, as you can see, in a fast-paced gallop across songs, while symphonic black metal uses heavier, melancholic music to accompany sweeping orchestral epics with darker, brooding vocals. These subgenres of metal both create environments of sound that are evocative of tragedy, solace, introspection, perseverance, and resilience. In connection to classic romantic painting styles, and this is the juicy part, metal musicians and vocalists approach their craft with highly technical and classically trained virtuosity, and yet they choose to create music and lyrics with romanticized and awestruck perception of the world. Both uphold a tradition of expert craftsmanship and use that as a foundation for wild explorations. This crossroad of technical skill and youthful imagination is tied very closely to the connection of natural science and fantasy that I'm seeking in my work. In navigating this category of research, I'm cognizant of the ways the fantasy genre can close off narratives by overtelling information to a too specific audience. So I'm trying to actually avoid the visual immediacy of artwork typically associated with metal music. So one of my goals in this program has been to figure out how to paint the feeling of something like a floating red skull in a tree stump without actually painting a floating red skull in a tree stump. All right, moving on. So for project materials, the works of this project are going to be drawings on paper using a combination of charcoal pencils, powdered charcoal, compressed charcoal, gum erasers, kneaded erasers, and blending tools. The drawings will be rectangular and large in scale, roughly 6 feet wide by 7 feet tall, or the horizontal version of that. The scale is meant to create an immersive, enveloping environment for the work, much like Robert Longo and Zaria Foreman's pieces. The drawings will feature ancient trees, streams, fog, forest fires, archaic symbols, ghostly forms, and a play of light and shadow. Beauty is an important aesthetic principle in my work, so my thesis will employ the same compositional and stylistic tactics to captivate the viewer and invite curiosity. I'll spend time visiting, sketching, and photographing in locations around the Pacific Northwest. Places like Mount Hood National Forest, Opal Creek Ancient Forest Center, Olympic National Park, and others. The drawings will be created from on-site sketches and photo references, online reference material, and my own imagination. I'll develop compositions with highly rendered areas and also areas of obscured forms and gestural marks to explore the ways to create an environment inside a frame. Resolving the works will be a give and take of media application. I'll draw, overwork, erase, wipe away, push and pull until a balance is reached. This flexibility will provide me opportunities for highly rendered naturalistic areas that suspend disbelief, and a vocabulary of marks unique enough to still remind the viewer it's a drawing. Here's a picture of a piece I'm currently working on. It's very unfinished, but similar to the pieces inspired by my Caldera series, there are explorations happening in the background of this and on the forest floor that I kind of see evolving into what I'll be working on in my thesis. Kind of broadening of the landscape, exploring more of the supernatural aspects and themes. I'm interested to see how these works at a larger scale are going to, or could possibly work together when on display to form the illusion of a greater singular landscape. This would kind of give me opportunities to create a harmony of resolved and unresolved moments, both narratively and technically, across multiple pieces. Oh, I forgot to switch to that earlier. So in conclusion, I've always been attracted to fantasy in the wild. Over the years, my dad and I have hiked through national forests, portions of the Appalachian Trail, Niagara Escarpment, and Smoky Mountains, and most recently, a northern section of the Pacific Crest Trail. As an adult, my attention has further turned towards ecological concerns of the wild and ways that I might find environmental organizations to work with. I've always had a desire to regard the deep, mysterious corners of the forest as places of ancient magic and spiritual omnipresence. In that way, I'm compelled to give meaning and importance to the wilderness by reconnecting to a sense of wonder from my youth. Using fantasy to create a personal mythology for the wild will help me generate a deeper understanding of nature, help me develop allegorical methods in conceptual ideation, and in turn strengthen a feeling of personal responsibility to both nature and fine art. If the work alludes to environmental activism, I'm ready to own that. What I hope to suggest is that there is more at stake than depicting the magnificent and the sublime, that an idyllic perception of nature is inspiring to the eye, but can be dangerous to the mind. As in fine art, there are alternative ways of understanding what is seen, that there is implied content beyond what is rendered, and greater forces at work underneath. I'd like for my thesis to traverse and hopefully blur the line between the natural and supernatural, formal and abstract, and by doing so, strengthen my bond with nature and revel in its mystery along the way. Thank you.
Curiosity towards how the individual works will form a singular landscape and display together. Do you find that you're consciously keeping that in mind within your individual compositions?
Yes, mostly. I would say I want to work on multiple pieces at a time, kind of neat and have and be working on them next to each other so that I can kind of form. I guess I don't want them to necessarily line up perfectly so it is one landscape across multiples. That is a possibility. I like the idea of them maybe alluding to being one, but that there might be moments of either stylistic or moments where the imagery doesn't line up, and that the look of a singular landscape might change with your distance to the work. Laura?
I'm hoping you can maybe just, and this is a little bit tricky, but the idea of aesthetic beauty,
Mm-hmm.
you can really unpack more what are those qualities for you that you're looking for in what you would term aesthetic beauty in this work. And then also if you can connect that with an emotional tone that you're trying to communicate.
Sure. So I think that the kind of the combination of like nuances in nature, our perception of the wild as a beautiful place, as a place we go to rekindle some youthfulness or find a calm place or a comfortable place that a lot of times I think naturalistic imagery, paintings and drawings of nature are kind of immediately soothing to begin with. I've always created work that I would consider to use a principle of beauty as a kind of connecting point. I don't want my works to be visually off-putting or create a sort of disdain or a dislike for the content. I've always wanted the work to kind of be beautiful in the sense that it attracts the viewer. They're visually pleasing. They elicit some sort of sense of comfort or welcoming or desire to be in that place, I suppose. I would like the work to kind of invite the viewer to or to make the viewer want to go to that place, or imagine themselves in that place. I think in my exploration of kind of the darker fantasy, the dark romanticism, and fantasy themes, that I want to sort of evoke this sense of magic or an enchantedness, that might be somewhat threatening, but overall inviting in a way. As far as beauty, like the actual term of beauty, that's something I've struggled with for a long time with my work, of just kind of acknowledging that the work is beautiful or the work might appear beautiful to some people, and I've always kind of strayed away from conversations about that because everybody has a different interpretation of beauty, and there's all of these questions of, well, what are the qualifiers for you to make something that would make something beautiful? I feel like on a base level, the way I draw is usually seen as beautiful. Maybe in part because of the technical aspects of it, the rendering, the ease in which things can be recognized. Although I kind of feel like it used to bother me when people would say my work is beautiful, but now I feel like I kind of understand on a broad level how they might mean it, and just let it be.
Yeah, and I think just to follow up a little bit, like there's all these other like specific qualities that make it beautiful. Like there's kind of a serenity, but also a sort of a somberness and a sadness. Kind of, I mean, they look a little bit melancholy.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just thinking of how you can shape your conversation of beauty towards, the kind of emotional tone that's being provoked. And just really quick, there was an article in the Sunday Times talking about sadness in music, and they use heavy metal to analyze how it is a fanatical generation of myth and has hysterical awe.
Thank you. New York Times, you said?
Follow up on that as well, because I just want to, in terms of your framing for conversation to this, that there's a tendency from what you just described is a degree of essentialism with this concept of beauty. And I wonder if you're able to address a question of either romanticism or accepted forms of landscape versus something like wilderness or the land. Like, how do you define a culturally inherited conception of things like that may be understood as forms of beauty or romanticism, or like the genres of landscape painting, for example, in relation to something like the wilderness, which for some people is frightening. That's this question of sublime also, and maybe horrific. Maybe I don't like nature.
Sure.
Give a shit. Or not care about landscape painting at all. So, I think that you may want to enter into a discussion, and you seem to, but I would bring it to this conversation of beauty back to those histories which you spoke about previously, such as romanticism, such as embellishment. And you might then also talk to somebody like Longo, who may be also using tropes of beauty, of romanticism, but with this like highly developed virtuosity, and that might be a different point of conversation than beauty, virtuosity.
Okay.
Talk a little bit more about activism, environmental activism in your work. Is that part? Sounded like you were interested.
Yeah, that's probably the kind of newest ideas that have, or newest subjects that have kind of started to become more evident in my work. I've become more active in at least my own participation in local organizations that protect nature to some degree. I think that that environmental activism could be a read found in my work and has been there for a long time. Only recently have I kind of addressed it as a possible conceptual approach, something that I would have in mind when creating the work, as opposed to just kind of saying, oh, you think this is about activism? Cool. That's fine. I feel like I'm coming to a place where maybe ownership of that and consideration for that is becoming more of an important aspect of why I make the work.
Amory, I'm curious if you've considered researching magical realism. Examples of that, at least like from films, are like Water for Chocolate, and also Amelie, where there is like this kind of high aesthetic of like beauty, but then also these like just kind of crazy supernatural elements, and a lot of them do come from nature. So I'm curious if like you've thought about that at all, and then also going back to the activism, if you're interested in incorporating Rachel Carson's Silent Spring into your like bibliography.
I'll look that up. I'm not familiar with it. So you said Silent Spring?
Yeah, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson. She was basically like the mom of like the current like environmental movement.
Okay. Yeah. I would say film plays into that kind of category of like the way supernatural elements, especially like in Amelie and like Water for Chocolate, are these kind of like little boosts of reality, or maybe they are communicating how the character feels as opposed to, or like, I don't know. I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be an interesting to kind of navigate this space between creating supernatural imagery that alludes to content as opposed to becoming its own content. I think there's definitely an extreme scale, like we saw in the metal paintings, that is too easy. It's too quick of a read. Doesn't ask many questions. I guess if the supernatural content of my work, I would want to be I guess to not answer any questions in a way, but to add to mystery. I don't know. I was talking with my mentor Ryan Pierce from last semester about implied fairies as opposed to actual fairies. So something along that line. Like, does that make sense?
Is there an interest in engagement with these histories of like romanticism or sublime landscape or metal, like this genre, to not exactly, not to be illustrative in that way of evoking this kind of almost escapist form of a romantic landscape, but something that engages more with these realities or issues of ecology that you're, perceiving as significant and important. You had like that tier 1, 2, 3, and it was like ecology, romanticism, and embellishment, right? Is that and then they seem to be on, the ecology seems to be in a very different place than the other two, and how to employ the other two to then not to actually get to something substantive, something real that also engages maybe in a critique of escapism.
I hadn't considered escapism, but I will definitely consider it now.
We have to take lunch. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks guys.